Okay, I have no idea what's.
Hi, I'm Dr. Cindy Dupuy. I have a PhD in learning disabilities, and I'm an adult with dyslexia and dysgraphia.
Hi, my name is Kim Sharman. I'm a reading and remediation specialist, and I work with kids with dyslexia, dysgraphia, and ADHD.
Okay, so today's topic is kind of short, I hope. I say that and then we end up talking for a long time. But when should you, if you're scheduled to do an IQ test like the WISC, when should you not go?
Whether it be at school or with a private person.
Yes.
Okay.
Can you think of situations, Kim, in which you should say, don't test my kid today?
Yes. If the kid has had a severe mental trauma and a breakdown or is in a horrible, sad state, um,
So if
absolutely
you're
not.
clinically depressed and the clinical depression is severe, and you're not going to really be able to go in and persist and work hard, you shouldn't take it. Okay. I also had a family that the night before the kid was scheduled to be tested, they were in the emergency room until 2 a.m.
Oh my Lord. Okay. Not good.
And then they went in the next day and the clinician's like, yep, we're doing it. I was like,
No.
what were they smoking? Right? Like, really? I understand that clinicians got to fill time slots. I get that. But your
Waste of
duty
time.
is to provide accurate data. And how is testing a kid that's had no sleep accurate data?
Also, if a
Okay.
kid's really sick,
If a kid is sick, a
don't
policy
do
in
it.
my office is if you're sick, don't come. Call,
Right.
we will reschedule,
Yeah.
right? Because that's in the best interest of the student. We're not going to get valid and reliable data. What's another instance in which you should not take a risk?
Well, the previous video we just met, if you have an extremely ADHD child, you don't just throw them at a couple-hour test.
Well, um, and many clinicians will do that where they'll say, hey, we're going to measure it. Well, at that point, you're measuring how the student is functioning with untreated ADHD, right? That's what you're actually measuring. You're not measuring true potential, you're measuring functioning with ADHD at current level. Does that make sense?
Yes, and can I just say one thing? We didn't say this in the last video. Why is it important that you get an accurate reading for an IQ? This is the bottom line. It's not so you can feel better about how smart your kid is. That's not the reason. What is the
Well,
reason?
the reason is you want to better understand what they're capable of doing and whether or not they need other intervention to support their learning. Now, we actually had a message from somebody that said, I went in, I didn't feel good that day, and I went ahead and took it anyway. And I came back with this crappy score, and now I feel horrible about myself. And I was like, you should never have taken the test. And they wrote back and said, well, I just wanted to get it over and done with. And now that individual is walking around thinking that their ability is not as high as it potentially could be. They sent me their scores and they had a number of really high scores. And so they're walking around with this inaccurate number that then they think is a limitation on what they can do. So just because you get a score on a WISC doesn't always mean that the score is valid. Does that
And
make
there's
sense?
And there's plenty of testing that goes on. I call it vanilla testing, where people are not attending to the details of what we have talked about in previous videos about having not having ADHD or not being treated for ADHD before you take the test. In addition, in regards to school, the scores of these and sometimes when you have a super IQ test, a high score, the school completely will say, you're smart, it's okay if you can't read because you're figuring things out. So sometimes a high score, I know it's crazy, but they if you have a high IQ, they'll say, "Oh, you know, you're fine. You'll be fine in life."
Well, and that's where parents need more education about what they should say in those instances because you reading on an average level, if you score in the 99th percentile, is a problem.
It's a huge
And
problem.
that's a whole other issue that we can talk about another time. Another great example of not going in cold to an IQ test is somebody that has anxiety. Like if you have test anxiety, then you really need to do some prior work, getting to know the clinician, understanding expectations, and that clinician needs to kind of gently walk you into expectations And in a situation like that, they may choose to do, there's the ability for a clinician to do the subtests out of order. That is discussed in the manual, and it is a viable option. So if you're going to stress somebody out by handing them red and white blocks to start with similarities or start with vocabulary. Like, there are other things that you could do so it doesn't feel like, oh my gosh, the clock is running, I've got to work fast, and I can't do well on this. Okay. Here's another good one. If you have some sort of injury, right? Like if your hand is not working well, or you're born with a condition that affects your ability to manipulate blocks, right? Then the clinician should be saying, I have to look at this individual's potential in another way, right?
Also, you always tell people, I want you to go get the eye test. I want you to get the hearing test. So sometimes you will say, you need to do this before you even come see me.
Yep.
And that's a huge one too.
I have a lot of kids that have sleep deprivation,
Mm.
where they have sleep apnea or restless leg syndrome, and they're not getting adequate sleep. And testing them again is going to test their functioning with that level of sleep, not their true potential. That measures how you're functioning that day at that health state versus when you're in optimal zone. And those are two very different numbers for two very different reasons, right? And so all IQ tests have to be viewed under the lens of, was it administered correctly? Was the person in adequate state to be taking the test? Was the test appropriate for the student? You know, there's a lot of different questions that go into that. And that's why in any evaluation, there is a behavior during testing. And it often drives me nuts because people will copy and paste and change the name and use the same behavior during testing over and over again. And that doesn't actually represent where the student was or any conditions. So literally last night, I wrote a behavior during testing that was a page and a half long.
Wow.
Because there were so many nuances and so many relevant factors to how that student was performing on that test and what the data meant and why I had concerns about the accuracy of the data. And
So you
so,
were talking about the accuracy of your own data because of the behavior of the child during testing.
yeah. So, you know, you want your kid to go in kind of optimal conditions, having had a full night's sleep, having gotten up and having a substantial breakfast, a healthy breakfast, right? And kind of prepared mentally to walk in with the understanding that we want them to give their best effort. They're not expected to know everything. That's not how the test works. And that if they can get in and provide their best effort and take the time to double check their work and really think critically about what they're doing, then we get data that is actually helpful and tells us more about what a student needs and why.
Good one.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks.